Hi, I'm Mark Castell, founder of AEI Speakers Bureau, and welcome to the Education Avengers Champions of Virtual Learning, Chapter 2. Our lives have changed since the pandemic, and the way that we teach our children in the future has also changed. We need to learn how to teach children virtually as well as we do in the brick and mortar classroom. Ken O'Connor shared a quote with me, which I found very telling. It's by Professor Christopher Deed. The most dangerous experiment we can conduct with our children is to keep schooling the same at a time when every other aspect of our society is dramatically changing. And certainly, our society has changed. With this introduction of the Champions of Virtual Learning, we will help your school districts and your teachers to become better. One of the things that this program has that we're featuring today is the live chat function. And I'd encourage you, as we move along, to have comments, questions, chat with your fellow attendees. Secondly, some people don't know how to do a webinar. The purpose of this program is so at some time in the future, you might be able to bring one of our superheroes of education to your school district virtually, which is cost effective, and impart their wisdom to your teachers. So one of the things that I'd like to offer you is AEI's experience in webinars. So if you have a question on how to run a webinar at this point, please call the company and AEI will help guide you through the process. Secondly, in the next few weeks, we'll have a tutorial on our website on how to run a webinar. Once you learn how to run the webinar, then you'll be able to bring in the superheroes of education. That being said, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, the author of the book, Now That's a Good Question, and he'll speak on Inquiring and Engaging Minds in the Virtual Environment. Please welcome Erik Francis.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. And I thank you for taking the time. I know time is a very valuable thing. It's funny because we are all at home and find our schedules more flexible now, but we've lost all sense of time. I can tell you every day I ask my wife, what time is it or what day is it? So, and time is a very, very important thing right now. And that's why we wanted to talk about how we're spending time and also how we're using the time effectively, not only ourselves as teachers, but also with our students. And that's how I'm going to talk to you about when it comes to this presentation I'm going to be doing today called Inquiring Minds. It is based on my book called Now That's a Good Question, How to Promote Cognitive Rigor Through Classroom Questioning, which was published by ASCD. If you'd like a copy of these slides, you may go to the address on the top, which is tinyurl.com/GQEduAvengers. And that's where you can access these slides and turn them into posters. Also, if you'd like to connect with me on Twitter, that'd be great. My Twitter handle is Maverick, MAVERIK EDU12. That's also the name of my company, Maverick Education. It's named after my daughters, Madison, Ava, and Amanda. And I'm also a child of the 80s, so you can probably guess what my favorite movie is, Top Gun. So let's get this started. Let's talk about how we can inquire minds, teaching and learning with good questions. And notice that term, good questions, because I want you to think about that and think about what that means. But the first thing I want to do is I want to ask you a good question. And this is to get you thinking. How is testing like baseball? I want you to think about that. I want you to think about the game of baseball, because what's interesting about baseball is whether the hitter can hit is not only about their skill, but also the quality of the pitch that they're given. Maybe they're given a good pitch. Maybe they're given a bad pitch. Maybe they're given an intentional pitch that they're not supposed to be able to hit. That's how testing is like baseball, because the items on assessments, what if I said they're not questions? They're actually items. And those items basically represent whether you can hit the ball. And on a standardized assessment, more often than not, you're given 3 chances, sometimes 5, and those 3 items will determine whether you can complete and meet the standard at its level of complexity and depth of knowledge. That's not teaching and learning with good questions. That is essentially like playing baseball. What am I doing right now? I am basically trying to hook your curiosity and interest in learning. Hopefully I grabbed your attention because we're going to be talking about how to ask good questions and how to inquire minds for the rest of this session. But hopefully now I drew you in. I call that the hook 'em. And what I'm going to be doing today is showing you this instructional process that answers this question. How could good questions be used to inquire minds to learn? And you're going to learn how you can use this framework to help you develop and deliver the good questions you need to inspire learning, especially right now in a pandemic, because we need to capture our students' attentions. And that's basically what we're going to be doing right now with Inquiring Minds. So one of the questions I'm often asked when it comes to good questions is people ask me, well, what is a good question? Well, that's not the question we really should be focused on. The question we should be really asking is, what does a good question do? And that's what I discuss in my book and also in my presentations. A good question should stimulate deeper thinking. You ask that question not to see what the students know, but to get the kids to want to learn. And also a good question deepens knowledge, understanding, and awareness. This question is not supposed to assess what the students know. It's supposed to provoke them and prompt them to go and deepen their knowledge, understanding, awareness of what they're learning. A good question also expands knowledge and extends thinking. It goes beyond that standard, beyond that learning expectation, beyond the level of complexity or depth of knowledge demanded by the item in our curriculum or in our assessments. More importantly, a good question should pique curiosity, imagination, interest, and wonder. When I ask you a good question, I am stimulating your brain not only to think critically, but think creatively. And most importantly, a good question allows students to express and share their learning in their own unique way. This is where students can basically go and express their knowledge, express their thinking, express their disposition, their feelings, their attitudes and beliefs in their own unique way. In my book, Now That's a Good Question, I identify 8 different types of questions we can ask the students to get them to think deeply and express and share their depth of knowledge. First are essential questions, and most of us are pretty familiar with that. And what I like to say about what is an essential question, it depends on who you read. Because if you read Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe, it says it's the most important questions our students can address. And if you read Ted Sizer, it's the question that addresses the core understanding and enduring ideas of a subject area or a content area. And if you read John Larmer from the Buck Institute, he says the driving question is what engages our students in a project-based learning, deeper learning experience. So what I did was I said there are 4 types of essential questions. First is the universal. That's the broader question. The question I might ask, what is life? It's those questions that we ask to get the kids to think about themes in literature. The overarching is a question we can ask in any subject area at any grade level. For example, I can ask, how can science explain natural events and phenomena, such as life? The topical is about the unit you're teaching. So if I'm teaching about how organisms grow and develop in an environment, that's the question I'm going to ask. How do organisms grow and develop in an environment? And the driving allows the students to go and express and share their learning in their own unique way. That question gets the kids to focus on talent development and how they can think creatively. So I could ask, how could you develop and use a model to explain how organisms grow and develop in an environment? The rest of the questions supplement the learning process. You have factuals. That's your who, what, where, and whens. You have your analyticals. Those ask you how and why. Your reflectives ask you to look for causes, connections, consequences. Your hypotheticals are the most creative questions we can ask. What if? What would happen? What could happen? Your argumentative should give choice. So don't just ask, should the death penalty be abolished? The really appropriate question, a good question would be, should the death penalty be abolished, legally permitted, or it depends on the situation? Because now you have it more of an open end that allows the students to have choice. The last set of questions is what I call the affective question. That addresses the affective domains and blooms. This is where you talk about your feelings, your beliefs, your attitudes. What do you think? How do you feel? What do you believe? And the personal question, which is a very, very powerful question, ask our students, what do they want to learn about the subject or topic? Now, I usually teach people how to ask these questions when we are in school in terms of a brick and mortar setting, in terms of a face-to-face, a one-on-one with a teacher. We have physical interactions. but this guideline can be used to help you really encourage your students to think deeply and express and share their learning as we do remote learning. So this is what I discuss in my book. But how do you teach with these questions? And that's where the inquiring minds process comes in. Because with the inquiring mind process, the first thing you do with the essential question, you hook them. You hook their interest. The factual questions focus on foundational knowledge. This is where they're going and inquiring the background knowledge and the functional understanding. The understanding questions are standards-based. This is where you're rephrasing your objectives into questions. The depth goes beyond the standards, and the expertise makes the learning experience personal. And again, this is the framework. If you notice, you start with the hook 'em, the now that's a good question to get them interested. The other levels you'll be asking throughout the learning process. So let's go through this together. With the hook 'em, what you do is you want to connect this learning experience to the real world. You want to go beyond the standards. You want the kids to get interested. You want the kids to think about things that they never ever learned before, they never ever thought about. This is really almost like the teaser for the blockbuster for the lesson you're going to provide. So a way to hook them for some examples is this. I might ask the students, how could change be scary but good? Or I might ask them, how could good things happen when you try new things? Or why should we be careful not to judge by appearances? See, I'm asking these questions because I'm about to teach you a lesson about The Green Eggs and Ham by Dr. Seuss. And the question I'm going to ask you that sets the instructional focus of this lesson is, how does Green Eggs and Ham express the following ideas? Change can be scary but good. When you try new things, good things could happen. And don't judge by appearances. And what that does is basically you're asking that deeper question. You're asking them to go deep or even sometimes beyond the text. I could even do an expertise question where I ask them, what do you think is the central idea or theme of Green Eggs and Ham and why, based upon the choices given? And if they don't like those choices, they can come up with their own. For the older kids in high school, when I taught high school, I asked them this, what is a hero? And then I asked them, what makes a hero fall from grace? Or I asked them, what causes a hero to fall from grace? And I also asked them, how could a hero redeem themselves if they fall from grace? These are the questions that got them interested in learning about Shakespearean tragic hero. And I was going to have them read Julius Caesar and Macbeth. And also, we're going to watch Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. And the question I'm going to ask them is, how are Brutus, Macbeth, and Anakin Skywalker examples of Shakespearean tragic heroes? And what are the similarities in the following? And I give them a list. These questions are not only going to be used to hook them, but this is also what I'm going to use to drive the deeper learning experience. When I taught history, sometimes you have to go and ask just a simple question. It doesn't have to be profound. So I can ask the kids, who was the President of the United States? And most likely they'll tell me George Washington. But when they Google it, they'll find a guy whose name is John Hanson. And John Hanson was actually the first president of the United States appointed under the Articles of Confederation. He was called President of the United States under Congress assembled. Washington was the first elected under the Constitution. So the question becomes then, should we consider Washington the first president of the United States, or should we also acknowledge not only Hanson, but also the 8 other presidents who were appointed annually under the Articles of Confederation? That's the hook. That's also the argumentative question I'm going to have my students address, because this is the question historians are asking. And it really is engaging. It goes beyond the standard. That's the deep question, the depth question. The understanding question comes from the standards. And the standards are about the Articles of Confederation. If you notice the way the standards are written, they're very, very directive. It says you will do this. What I would do is change that standard into a question. So I'd ask them, how did the weakness of the Articles of Confederation lead to the writing of the Constitution? I would make that the instructional focus, and I would also make that the single summative assessment question. And for the rest of the objectives, I would just rephrase those into questions. And what's interesting is those questions will assess the depth and extent of student learning much more than an item on an assessment or in the curriculum, because most items on assessments and curriculum, they assess at or up to the standard. They don't always assess at the standard because that would be too difficult. What this does is that it assesses student learning at the standard and has them demonstrate and communicate their learning deeply in their own unique way. In math, what I would do is this. I would just ask this question. I walk in my class, I said, how could multi-digit numbers be multiplied using the standard algorithm? And I'll show them there are 5 different ways. And by the end of this learning experience, I'm going to ask them, which way works best for you and why? Is it this way? Is it this way? Is it this way, or this way? And what's interesting is, excuse me, that last example, I can't teach that. I don't get it. But I would show them a video that explains it, and I would have them explain it to me. And whichever way they want to do this, that becomes their question. Another way to get the hook 'em is to ask a question that focuses on how they're going to develop what I call their expertise. And what this does is that this question gets them not only to think deeply, but also think creatively and develop their talent. So when I'm teaching a lesson on science, and I'm teaching them about the hypothesis that California is going to sink into the ocean because of a giant earthquake, the theory of the big one, I ask them, how could you analyze and interpret data on natural hazards to forecast future catastrophic events and inform the development of technologies to mitigate their effects? The standard actually starts at the first Bloom's verb, which is analyze. But what I did was I simply put, how could you in front of the standard? That makes any standard a deeper question that focuses on expertise. So when I have my next generation science standards, what I can just do is I can take that standard right there and put how could you in front of it. Now I have a question. And it's the deepest question I can ask the kids, because not only does it set the instructional focus beyond the standard, but it also assesses them authentically, delving into their expertise. In fact, if you want to do this with your lessons now, while you're teaching online, take every standard you have and just basically put how could you in front of it, and they all turn into questions. So that's another way you can hook them. And that's how I used to get my students interested in learning as well, because they learn what they're going to do by the end of this lesson. Another way is to show them the deep question. And you saw some examples of that before. But deep questions should go beyond the standard. Deep questions should really get them thinking about what are the connections, making connections between what they're learning in class, deep within a subject area, across the curriculum, across text, or beyond the classroom. It's the creative question we can ask. What if? That's the most creative question we can ask the kids. It's also argumentative questions where they have to choose this or that, and they have to defend, explain, and justify their responses. So when I'm teaching with deep questions, what I could ask the kids is this. There's their driving question. That's that question for expertise. I can ask them the hypothetical. What if a giant earthquake struck a geographic location? It doesn't just have to be California. It can be New York. It can be inland in the United States. It can be anywhere in the world. What if it struck? What would happen? The argumentative would be, will the big one in California be caused by the San Andreas fault or by the Mendocino fault? Now they have to defend, explain, and justify which one's going to basically cause the big one to happen in California. With math, I would ask them this. What if you reorganize these numbers? How could you provide this number sentence is true? So what happens with this is that they just take the numbers there and they just change the order. And they're basically creating all the problems. I'm not giving them 25 problems to solve. I'm just saying to them, how could you reorganize those numbers and prove it's true using one of the ways? That's also depth. Oops. Now, these are the deeper questions we aspire to ask. These are the questions, when I talk to people, I say, I want to know deep questions. I want to ask the questions that really engage kids' thinking. And good questions aren't basically judged qualitatively. It's what good questions do, the question I asked you before. So you can ask foundational questions, and they'll be good questions. But the thing about foundational questions, what I encourage teachers to do is this. Ask the kids, what do they know and understand? and have them respond in the form of a question. I call this bizarro Jeopardy. It's the opposite of Jeopardy. Instead of being Alex Trebek and you give them the information, you have to demonstrate their knowledge by responding in the form of a question, present the information and ask them, what is it you don't know and understand? So here's an example. This is also to help you understand Bizarro a little bit, if you remember this episode from Seinfeld, in which Jerry met the complete opposite of him. It's a complete opposite experience because the teacher's not making the foundational questions. It's the student who is creating the foundational questions. So when I introduce this learning expectation for history about the Articles of Confederation, I will show this to the students and ask them, what are the words, terms, and details you don't know and understand? How would you phrase that as a question to me? And they basically would free write and write all the questions they have based upon what they're reading. What I then do is I gather their questions and I organize them in different columns. So with academic vocabulary, those are the academic and literary words that appear in every subject area. The subject-specific terms, those are the subject terms that are specific to that subject area. The data and details, ask the kids those questions, ask what are the facts and information they need to know and understand. Now, I'm not generating any of these questions. These questions come from the kids. They are basically developing the foundational learning experience. It's driven by their questions. I may add a few, but it's more of an iterative process. Now I'm basically assessing prior knowledge and I'm letting my students know I care enough to take the time for you to learn this, but you have to communicate to me what it is you don't know and understand. That's the foundational learning experience for inquiry. I learned this working with English language learners. This actually was an example of what I use when I work with English language learners. I would show them the standard and I would show them a sample problem. I'd say, what are the words and terms and details you don't understand? And they'd have to phrase it to me in the form of a question. They couldn't just say fluently. They couldn't just say algorithm. They'd have to say, what does fluently mean? They'd have to say, what is an algorithm? What is the standard algorithm for multiplication? And based upon their questions, we build background knowledge and vocabulary development. We are building background knowledge using factual questions driven by the students. If you don't think academic vocabulary is essential or we should spend the time on it, look at this standard here. This is the science standard on natural hazards. Look at all the academic vocabulary the students have to know and understand in that standard. Look at all the terminology. Look at all the data and details. Now, when I create these questions, this is my pre-planning. I'm basically presuming what the kids might not know and understand. But I ask the kids, what are the words, terms, and details you don't know and understand? They come up with these questions. So when they come in, they see this as a blank slate, and then I put their questions up, and they feel invested because I'm taking the time to basically have them create the foundational learning experience. The next set of questions is understanding, and those come directly from the standards. Standards are not questions, they're objectives. They are written as directives. You sound like a drill sergeant when you basically post your objective. We need to basically turn these into questions. And there's two ways you can do this. The first way, what you can do is you can piece it together using this grid. And I'm going to give you a copy of this when you go and download the PowerPoint presentation. The first thing I would do is I would identify all the Bloom's verbs. So there are my Bloom's verbs there, and I put them in the form of be performed. Then I'm looking to see what is the instructional focus, what's the content. So they're going to perform operations, or they're going to multiply multi-digit numbers, or they're going to use a standard algorithm. The rest of the standard or the objective is the condition. That sets the depth of knowledge, what exactly and how deeply students will understand and use their knowledge. I then put the question stem in, how, and the helping verb, can or could. Now, it's important to understand the difference between can or could. Can is procedural. How can you do this? Could is hypothetical, which means that there's more than one way. Now, one of the philosophies I have is, why is it we differentiate instruction? We don't differentiate professional development. If you don't like this way, another way you can do this, when you take away the grid, it makes the question. Another way you can do this is basically you can take your standards, which is written as an imperative sentence, a command, And then you can basically turn it into a declarative sentence. For example, it says perform operations with multi-digit numbers. Well, guess what? Operations with multi-digit numbers can be performed. Fluently multiply multi-digit numbers using a standard algorithm. Well, multi-digit numbers can be multiplied fluently using a standard algorithm. You're going to tell me how. That's another way you can turn your standards into questions. And what you're doing is you're de-emphasizing that pitch. You're asking them, how can baseball pitches be hit? Or how could different baseball pitches be hit? This is really effective working with English language arts standards because they're very conceptual. But we need to figure out and talk about the book. So what I would do with English language arts is I would take the standard and I would write the enduring understanding, which is about Brutus and Macbeth are both examples of complex characters. We call them Shakespearean tragic heroes. That's the facts. I asked them then to go and get the evidence. How are Brutus from the tragedy of Julius Caesar and Macbeth from Macbeth complex characters, and what are the similarities in their following? Now they have the facts and the enduring understanding. I've given them the answer. Now they're going deeper because now they have to go and get the evidence to support their responses. So when it comes to teaching and learning with good questions, how can you do this remotely? Well, get the kids excited about learning, hook them, get them interested. If they're on devices, they have the library of the world at their fingertips. Ask them a question that they can go out and acquire that information. That's actually an important life skill we need to teach our kids. Once we have that, once we hook them, look at your standards. How can I rephrase that objective into a question? That will be your understanding question. How can I get creative with my questions to get them go deeper beyond the standards? What if I just put, how could you in front of every objective? Now I have my expertise. And when it comes to the foundational, simply give the kids either the standard or the segment of text and say, okay, what are the words, terms, and details you don't know, understand? That's how you inquire minds, not only in remote learning, but in life. So I'd like to thank you for being here with me today, and thank you for everything you do. Again, here's your checklist. What does a good question do? If your question does even one of these things, you can feel confident you asked a good question. Thank you again for having me today. Again, this is who I am. My company's called Maverick Education. And if you'd like further information, please contact me through AEI Speakers, or you can visit my website. Thank you again. And thank you, Mark and AEI Speaker, for having me be one of the Edu Avengers. I'm proud to be one.
Thanks, Erik. That was an enlightening presentation. We all appreciated it. The chat room was lighting up too, so that was fantastic. So our next person in line is a leading expert on poverty and the author of Turning High Poverty Schools into High Performing Schools. Her presentation will be on equity in distance learning. Kathleen Budge.
Thank you, everybody. I am really happy to be here. Let me get this started. I am going to talk today about, I normally do talk about poverty, but today I'm going to talk about a broader lens and look at inequity and equity, and going to give you some just-in-time ideas for an old problem in a new context. I want to start today by sharing with you something a principal just said I had surveyed this principal, and this was her thoughts. Once the initial shock and stress of learning to teach an entirely new way diminished, the teachers jumped right in and got to work. They continue to grow stronger each day and more creative. I knew they were good, but I have a deeper appreciation for them. I have learned the value of what we do. I have learned that as busy as we still are, there are moments that allow us to slow down, reflect, and focus on what's important. I've learned we are stronger than we believe. I suspect there's a lot of principals out there who feel exactly the same way. They've grown in their appreciation of the teachers that they serve. And I just want to start out today by giving a shout out to all educators. They're engaged in creativity, creation, innovation, persevering, and you've never been more important to this country than you are right now. So let's dive into this subject of equity. in this new normal. So in schooling BC, as I've come to call it, before COVID-19, there was a lot of inequity, and our schools have mirrored the inequity in society. There was inequity in the environments that we provided kids who live in poverty and kids of color disproportionately. There were inequities in the opportunities we provided those kids programmatically. And there were inequities in the quality of what we gave those kids in terms of, for example, teacher quality. So inequity is not a new problem. It's an old problem in a new context. Just recently, in a really great blog done by Marceline Dubose, I hope I'm saying that right, and Paul Gorski, they said in that blog a question that I think is so important moving forward in terms of this equity work. They said, let's recognize that when we talk about this crisis only in terms of newness, we fail to recognize its connection with generations of inequity. As a result, we limit the impact of our equity responses. And you can see their question up here, just as Erik was talking about questions. This is a great question. What will we make of the new normal? Which is really the question that's going to guide the rest of the time that I have with you as I talk through this. So a little bit about where I'm coming from. As Mark talked about, I am the co-author of a few books. All of these things that you're seeing on the screen right now are published by ASCD. We have just had our second edition of Turning High Poverty Schools into High Performing Schools come out. In fact, this past month, it was the member book for ASCD. And the Disrupting Poverty book, came out in 2018. These two books look at education in two different ways. One is school-wide, what do we do with poverty? And the other one is in classrooms. And to tap into the knowledge base, we actually interviewed educators from across the country for both books. What I'm going to do today is really, as I said, widen that lens, and we're going to look at equity not just through poverty, but in part through the practitioners that we have had access to, as Bill Parrott and I, my co-author, have done this research. Our second edition that's just coming out came out actually about 10 years after the first edition. And so we've had a decade of changes. One of the things we know about leaders in high poverty, high performing schools is that they take action in three broad arenas. They foster a healthy, safe, and supportive learning environment. They focus on learning, but not just student learning, professional learning, and the system, the school itself getting smarter about the way it does business, and they build internal capacity. That also results in collective efficacy. The reason that I'm actually connecting this work to what I'm going to talk about today is that at the core of what these leaders do is they level the playing field. They commit to equity to level the playing field. So about a month ago now, a few folks that Bill and I have worked with on a long-term basis. It's not unusual for us to go into a school or a school district and work on a long-term basis. Often these are places that want to become high-performing. Often they are high poverty, have lots of kids that live in poverty, and just as often a lot of brown and black kids. And so these are places that beat the odds. Despite the challenges that their children face, they outperform the state. They outperform their districts often.
Kathleen,
standardized tests. Yes?
Yeah, you need to share your screen. I'm sorry, your slides aren't coming up.
Oh, they aren't? Oh, no. Okay, I'm sorry. Wow. I've been talking for a long time. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. Let's just see if we can get it functioning.
All right. Let's see.
I mean, if you haven't...
There we go. Is that coming up?
Thanks.
Wow, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay, so some folks called us and said, hey, we are struggling with, a lot of equity-related issues. We want to know, what are we going to do with grades? What should we do with assessment? We've got lots of kids who don't have access to technology. So we spent a good number of hours out in cyberspace looking at what were people doing, what were the experts saying in this context. But then we thought, let's circle back to these leaders in the high poverty, high performing schools who've had a lot of capacity, as I was showing here. Let me just show this. A lot of capacity in answering questions that about equity and about a lot of other things about serving kids who often come to school needing more. And so we circled back with them, sent out a survey, and also spent, as I said, many hours looking at how other systems, schools, educators, whole systems are sort of building the plane as they go. And I have 12 ideas I want to share with you today. And honestly, I wish now that I'd heard Erik that I would have listed these as questions. So as you see these, think about how are you making safety and the well-being of students, families, faculty, and staff the first priority? So let me say again, these 12 things came from two sources: the leaders in these high-performing, high-poverty schools, and through our kind of check-in with experts in the field to get their sort of just-in-time take on what is it that schools and school districts should do. How should they think about equity in this environment? The one thing that we know absolutely is that a bright light has been shown on the inequities that are both in society and in schools. But schools are doing things about them, and particularly schools that had a lot going for them to begin with, we can learn from those schools. So 12 things I'm going to share with you. In the learning environment, every single principal we interviewed said that safety and the well-being of the people they serve, students, families, faculty, and staff, was their first priority. So that was their first consideration. Ensuring access, equitable access, or another way to think about that is equitable learning opportunities, access to those. It doesn't always mean that everybody has the same access to things, but how do we make the learning opportunities rich? So what we find here is that schools have done a ton of things in this area. Many schools have given hundreds of devices out to families. They have helped families or provided high-speed internet. They have outfitted buses with Wi-Fi as Wi-Fi hotspots. And those buses either go to neighborhoods or sometimes they stay in the school parking lot and people come to them. So there's a whole variety of ways that schools and school districts have provided technology. But then even with all that effort, there are still places where these school districts are having to do low-tech options, paper packets, even to the point of doing teleeducation. So they're literally picking up landline phones and calling on landline phones and teaching through those means. Lots of different ways. Now, with all that work, the other thing that we know is that there's a fairly low participation rate across the country. There was one study done that it was a small study, but it was an initial study where they found that 47% of teenagers across the country, about 1,000 teenagers were contacted, had not yet participated in any of the learning opportunities their school was offering. So low participation is a problem. That said, in the high-performing, high-poverty schools that we studied, it is much less of a problem. Most of those school leaders said that they had 80 to 100% of their students participating in what they were offering. So how did that come to be? I'm having a little trouble with this. So here are some ideas. These are the things that they did to troubleshoot the low participation. I won't be able to talk about all these things, but let's talk about this one because it seems like this is sort of where people are right now. So first of all, they prioritized connection with families and kids over academics. It was just important to get in contact with them. And there were a ton of ways that they did that. Some schools had a protocol, or school districts had a very structured protocol, like the teacher was the first line of defense, but then a counselor, then maybe an AP, and then the principal, and they just kept at it. They wouldn't give up on kids. Many schools talked about using multiple means of connection. So texting, cell phones, landlines, even writing letters, porch visits, all kinds of ways. There was a really great podcast that I listened to on Reset, and they were interviewing a teacher in Appalachia, rural Appalachia, and she was saying she has a spreadsheet where she keeps track of the best way to contact her kids. Another way that they are troubleshooting low participation is that they're engaging the whole village. They're not just, as I indicated in the protocol, they're not just asking teachers to shoulder this. So they are engaging the principal, the vice principal, teachers' assistants, coaches, counselors, everyone is engaged in trying to connect with kids and families. The other thing that they're doing is a lot of them are making themselves small. When you make yourself small, it's more doable. What do I mean by small? They organized before they left, before they transitioned, but it would be probably possible to do it right now. They organized themselves in ways, for instance, they used homerooms. And so one teacher had one set of kids that she was responsible for. Other places used advisory that they had in place. One school district required a vulnerable student list for every school to come to the district office and to the superintendent. And it's expected that those vulnerable kids are checked on. There's a check-in with them weekly. One of the things that we need to think about, and this was something that was out there in cyberspace, was preparing teachers or whatever educators are making these connections with kids, preparing them for the anxiety that they are likely to encounter when they make these connections. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And the other thing to keep in mind that could be related to low participation is the idea that if you're requiring synchronous sessions, you may want to think about, or at least be sensitive to the fact that sometimes for some kids, just the background that we can be exposed to when we're asking kids to Zoom in. So they maybe have gotten a device, they have the internet, but it may not be comfortable for some kids to actually have you zooming into their lives. So that's something we need to be sensitive to. And the last idea that I just want to share is that people said a lot about focusing on leveraging relationships. So if they knew they had a family that was at risk, that they weren't able to contact, they leveraged a relationship that they knew somebody had a relationship with that family. It wasn't necessarily the teacher, it wasn't necessarily the counselor, but it was someone the family trusted. So equity in learning, what are schools doing as they build this plane, just like I'm sure that many of you feel like you're doing, to ensure equity in this arena of learning? They're rethinking grading practices. Many of these have done a hold harmless approach. So wherever those kids were at the end of third quarter, their grade won't go lower. Many times those kids have options to improve their grade. Some schools have gone to a pass-fail, but as Paul Gorski and Marcelina said in their blog that they wrote for ASCD, if we're failing kids in this environment, we've really got to think about our commitment to equity. So many factors kids don't have control over. Others are, really emphasize that they've really focused on assessment for and assessment as learning. They talked about meeting the diverse learning needs, and we'll talk more about that one, students' needs and diverse learning needs of adults, and something I'm calling pedagogical lemonade. They are making out of lemons pedagogical lemonade. Let's talk a little bit about addressing diverse learning needs. So again, the principles that we sought to get answers from to help all of you that are asking questions, and particularly those educators that had contacted us, we again had a hunch that if schools had a lot of things going before we went to what some people are calling emergency learning, what might they have to offer? Well, some of them said, we just moved right into it. We meet kids where they are and we differentiate. If you're not doing that, that is something to think about. One of the ways that they're meeting needs. Many people talked about small group instruction. Google Meets was one example of the way they were delivering that for kids who are in special education, who are getting English language learning services. They also talked about additional time, and that looked like office hours. Sometimes that looked like tutoring offered both in low-tech and high-tech ways. Low-tech meaning literally over the phone or via packets with an over-the-phone feedback loop. So, and then the third thing that I would say about additional time is a lot of people have their radar on summer school right now. What is it that they can do in those months? And it's likely to be virtual, but what are they going to do? Some schools talked about really focusing on universal learning design. So that's something to take a look at. And again, small makes monitoring student progress doable. So again, are there ways that you can make yourself small through advisories, through homerooms, through vulnerable student lists, those sorts of things? They have repurposed partnerships, often to provide tutors. And as one superintendent said, we've gotten smarter. We are really asking ourselves the question, what learning for what students, at what time, and why? Now let's talk a little bit about some silver linings. Many of the principals that we interviewed, as well as what we saw out there sort of in cyberspace, people are writing blogs and doing podcasts about some surprising silver linings in all of this. And these silver linings may in fact help us to reach a wider audience of kids. One of the things that they talked about were a sense of increased collaboration, of working together, and that there was actually more time working together in this environment than they had when they were in a brick and mortar situation. And the quality of what was happening, not maybe at the very beginning, but as they continue to work together, is getting better. It talked about peer support, and particularly of some teachers that they thought they were really worried about. And again, we're talking about equity for both kids and teachers. Peer support, teachers that they were worried about really stepping up to the plate to help others out, teachers who had expertise in online instruction, really helping each other out. They talked about these richer tasks where they were integrating SEL more than ever because of their sensitivity over the trauma and stress that both families and kids are likely to be undergoing right now. They talked about giving kids choice and helping them understand that there are some can-dos and some must-dos. Many people talked about doing things like project-based learning, place-based learning to sort of up the rigor, but also to make it slightly more family-friendly. It wasn't uncommon to see people saying, let's do a project or let's do some place-based learning around the pandemic. One principal said, teaching and kids doing, they'd had to step away from that notion of teachers teach, kids do, to a notion of more, let's give kids experiences, let's give kids challenges, let's ask them what they did, and let's give them feedback. The other thing is there's lots of conversation about creating equity among teachers and ultimately for the benefit of kids by providing just-in-time PD. What are schools doing to build their capacity and to build their efficacy? So 3 more suggestions. They're engaging the whole village. And what I mean by that is, every adult in a school, it's not just the teachers, it's not just the specialists, it's not just the principal. They have, the kitchen staff involved, they have the teacher's assistants involved, they have the school secretary involved in a variety of ways. And that becomes a really important piece. They're also stepping back and asking themselves, what does it mean to engage families? And in this environment, engaging families, they have found mostly means supporting families in order to support their children. We'll say a little bit more about that in just a minute. And everywhere, there's an emphasis on self-care, on giving ourselves as educators grace, knowing we're going to make some mistakes, and having a work-life balance. So just a little, a few ideas about supporting families to support their children. Again, as I said, a lot of the issues around supporting families were around access. And in making this transition, we just saw how inequitable access to learning opportunities is. So in addition to the technology that I spoke about earlier, lots of schools were providing for basic needs. They were continuing to feed kids. They were strengthening partnerships that they had perhaps with the food bank or engaging in new food banks. Some of them were engaging in new partnerships with counseling agencies, with medical facilities. They were providing things like musical instruments and art supplies. They were centralizing some of their communication. If a parent has 5 kids in school, they were having to connect with at least 5 teachers. And if some of those kids were in the secondary, they might have to connect with 5 teachers within the secondary. So schools and districts were getting smart about centralizing some of that communication. I'll say more about that in a minute. One school talked about using a Google Doc as a directory, where the only thing a family had to do was get to that Google Doc, and then they could click on that Google Doc and get to a teacher that they wanted to have contact with. They were finding ways to have two-way communication, particularly at the district level. They talked about having spaces on their web page where parents could give feedback. One superintendent has a student advisory group that she meets with weekly, virtually, of course. Again, they were helping parents separate the must-do from the can-do. And they increasingly moved away from thick packets of worksheets to things that provided that could be done in the home, and emphasizing the rich learning environment that homes can be. And so simple things like take a walk, and if that means walking in your backyard, if that means walking around the block, and then write about it or video about it or do an audio cast about it, those sorts of things. The idea that teachers write lesson plans and parents follow them seems to have evolved for many of these schools and school districts, where there was a greater emphasis on let's just connect with families, let's find family-friendly activities they can do. Always, 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 reading to and reading with kids is going to be an educative experience. In the end, what we're doing now, Bill and I are working with schools and school districts to help them plan a new normal. And I will say, sort of basing this on Erik's wisdom, we have taken these 12 areas and created a planning tool. And the planning tool is really filled with questions for a school or a school district to ask themselves in terms of what do we need to be thinking about as we think about equity in this new normal. Really great report. You see the source at the bottom of the screen. What if we, pause, don't return to school as usual? By Hugh Vasquez. He is a senior associate of the National Equity Project. He said this: nothing changes without disturbance. Since it's people who change things, that means change can't happen until people are disturbed. It is in this place of discomfort where we expand our beliefs and innovations are born. When we are disturbed, we change. Probably, I don't know that I can think of certainly in our lifetimes, perhaps for the last century, maybe more, have we had a global disturbance like this pandemic. And the question really remains, what will we do with the new normal? What kind of a new normal will we build? Will we build on the silver linings and take the opportunity to once and for all double down on the inequities and create a more equitable system? Thanks, and I'm glad that I had this chance. Sorry about missing those first few slides. I will have all these slides up so that you can get them. And again, thank you so much for what you're doing every day.
Thanks, Kathleen. Great presentation. We all really enjoyed it. So thanks again. Also, just so everybody knows, in the chat room, I posted a URL. All the decks of slides for all 3 presenters will be available on our website probably the beginning of next week. This program will be available starting tomorrow, and we will have the slides available for your review at the URL that's in the chat room. So our next speaker has several books on brain-based learning. He'll conclude this week's program with virtual learning and the brain. May I introduce John Almarode.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Almarode, and it is an absolute pleasure to be with you today. I appreciate you setting aside time in your day to spend with us. I want to talk to you about the science of how we learn. Over the last 150 years, cognitive science has put together a body of knowledge about how our cognitive architecture works together to maximize learning outcomes. What is most fascinating about their findings is that whether we are in our living room or a laboratory, whether we're in our kitchen or our classroom, the garage or the gymnasium, our cognitive architecture and the science of how we learn says that those rules, those principles hold consistent. And so that's really what we want to talk about today. In the brief time I have with you, I want to share with you information on the science of how we learn, 4 basic principles that can be translated to any learning environment. And I want to get started by asking you, and I realize I'm smaller than I ought to be, but if you've got some scrap paper close by, if you would just make a quick grid. This shouldn't take any longer than about 30 seconds. If you're sitting at your kitchen table, you can write on your table. If you've got a sleeve close by, that's fine as well. But we're going to make a quick grid to put together 4 ideas about how we learn. So just take about 30 seconds and make your grid. We're going to really use this to copy down some information or to summarize. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to make this grid. Now, what's fascinating about the 4 principles we're going to talk about today is that we've already hit on several of them in terms of their application. For example, Erik talked about a hook 'em. Well, that's going to demonstrate principle number 1 that we're going to get to in just a second. When it comes to type of questions, Erik talked about that. Then we get into argumentative questions, giving learners choices about the Constitution and who should or should not be identified as the president, or what should you do with the death penalty, and then bizarro jeopardy. What's even more fascinating is that if you look at the equity information that Kathleen shared with us, these 4 principles help us promote equity by offering learners the highest level of rigor and engagement possible when we focus not necessarily on their background characteristics or what they come to the table having experienced or not experienced, but focus on providing high quality experiences that are based on how we learn. To get started, it makes me think of this 92-year-old man. He wasn't feeling the best, so he goes and sees his family doctor. The doctor checks him out, sends him off for some advice. Later on that day, the doctor's out walking his dog, and he looks up and he sees this 92-year-old man. He's playing in the park, throwing a frisbee, spending time with a woman, a beautiful woman, a third of his age. The doctor walks over and says, "Well, you must be feeling better." The old guy says, "Well, doc, I'm just doing what you said to do. You said get a hot mama and be cheerful." The doctor said, "No, I didn't say that. I said you had a heart murmur, be careful." How often do we say things to our students? How often do we present things in classrooms, and what we say and what they hear and they report back the next day are completely different? The science of how we learn helps us connect with our intention, with our outcomes, and ensure that students maximize their learning. In other words, let me put it this way on a Thursday afternoon. It helps our learners understand the difference between a hot mama and a heart murmur. So let's get started. I want to share some information with you, and I want to do it through a quick share of some slides. Our goal here is to talk about how to better understand how our students engage in learning and the implications that it has on our teaching. On the screen, you see several statements about the science of learning. These statements come from pop literature, they come from the media, they even come from books that report to be about learning. But some of these statements are true and some of these statements are false. I'm going to give you a minute and a half and I'm going to start my timer, and I just want you to skim through there and decide which of these statements you think are true and which of these statements you think are false. You have about a minute and a half. Go. About 45 seconds. Read quickly. Make a quick decision, true or false. Wrap up. Make a quick decision. All right, here we go. Number one, learners remember everything. That's false. We're actually designed to forget. The trick is, how do we leverage what we know about how learners learn so that they remember? And by the way, we can apply this principle to a learner who's on Zoom, WebEx, Teams, or working from home, synchronous or asynchronous. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Physical education improves performance. That's false. Physical education gets the brain ready. Effective teaching and learning improves performance. We'll get back to that maybe a little bit, but I will tell you that research is a little bit confusing. Physical education gets our brains ready. High quality teaching helps with the learning. You can spend all day long on an exercise bike, but if we don't provide high quality math instruction, our math scores aren't going anywhere. Number three, offering learners the opportunity to struggle leads to better learning. That's true. It's called productive struggle, and we're going to get to that principle in just a second. We are multitaskers, although some are better than others. That's false. That means when we present information online, we have to make sure that we don't ask our learners to do different things at one time. If you noticed, when I put up these statements, I didn't read them to you. I simply got quiet for a minute and a half and let you work through them. Had I chosen to read those statements at the same time you were reading them, that would have been overload, multitasking, and not as effective. We'll come back to that. Number five, digital natives. In other words, this should be nothing for learners. They're digital natives. It turns out there's no such thing as a digital native. That's a complete myth. So we have to treat this as learners walking into new space. They've used Facebook. They've used Twitter. They've used Instagram, TikTok. I don't even know what that means. They've never used it in this way, which means they are not digital natives when it comes to this type of learning. Number six, completing a ton of reading, note-taking, and problems is going to solve the issue. That's false as well. These 6 questions lead us to the 4 big principles behind how we learn. So I want to do this by bringing you back into the picture. So I asked you to set up this grid, and we're going to move through these in just a second, but I'm going to give you a way to remember them. So for example, here we go. Principle number 1. We only remember what we encode. So we're going to come up with a gesture for that so that you remember it. We only remember what we encode. If you would do this, if you're home by yourself, it shouldn't be a problem. If someone else is in the room, blame it on pandemic brain. But this is, we only remember what we encode. Number 2, once we encode it, we have to make an effort to retrieve it. The second principle behind how we learn is we have to practice retrieving. So this is our gesture. This is our gesture. We have to retrieve to remember. So let's review. Number 1, we only remember what we encode. In other words, if we don't actively encode it into our brains, we're not going to remember it. It'll just be a fleeting thought. The second principle is we have to retrieve it to remember. We have to practice retrieving it, actively retrieving that information. So do we provide our learners with things on Zoom or WebEx or whatever system you use? Do we give them practice retrieving that information? Do we help them elaborately encode that information so they'll remember it? For example, the questions that were proposed around Macbeth and the tragedy of Julius Caesar, or what about the questions around green eggs and ham? How did we get them involved to elaborately encode? Or what about our students that come from high poverty backgrounds? Did we give them opportunities to engage in authentic learning? That produces elaborate encoding. And did we allow them to discuss and retrieve that information later? The third principle is learning is a struggle and takes time. In fact, the harder we have to work for something, the stronger the memory trace, which means when our learners have to struggle a little bit, it creates stronger memory traces. So rule number 3 is learning is a struggle and takes time. So we have to encode to remember, retrieve. Learning is a struggle and takes time. The last part of the learning sequence and the last principle I want to spend some time on is the role of feedback. We survive on feedback. Feedback is the absolute most important thing we can possibly have in life. If we notice something isn't right, we adjust. If we notice something isn't going well, we fix it. If we notice it is going well, we keep doing it. But that requires us to get feedback. It's important that we give and receive feedback. Maybe we use Zoom and put students into breakout groups and have them peer edit. Maybe we use Google Docs, and so before they submit a paper to us online, we have them go through a peer review process using a rubric. That's a great teaching practice, but the reason it's a great teaching practice is because of feedback. So how do we remember feedback? It has to be exchanged between us and the learner. So let's take 30 seconds. We're going to practice our gestures. Remember, we only remember what we encode. We have to retrieve. It's a struggle and takes time, and we have to have feedback. Take about 30 seconds, and wherever you are, whether you're in your living room, your kitchen, your garage, or your basement, make sure you know the gestures and the 4 principles behind how we learn. You have 30 seconds. Go. Excellent. So let's dive into a couple of these in a bit more detail, and then we'll move on. When we talk about elaborate encoding, one of the ways we elaborately encode is allow kids to make multiple representations of things. For example, if I'm teaching about graphs in kindergarten, then maybe I have learners construct a graph of the different snacks they have, or the different crayons they have, or the different types of shoes they have. So they're constructing a bar graph using something that's available to them around the house. If those materials aren't available for whatever reason, they can do a bar graph of how many things they can see that are the color green and the color red. Getting them to elaborately encode requires making multiple representations, looking for patterns, and invoking that emotion. When it comes to retrieval practice, we have to make an effort and go get it. So the first time we hear something, we often have to repeat it within 30 seconds or we're going to forget it. How quickly do we have to repeat it? If you said 30 seconds, not only did you get the answer right, but you just modeled the strategy. Then we have to revisit it over a period of 2 to 3 hours and then a period of days. So what are we doing with students in online environments that encourage retrieval? Are we finding ways to blend things together? Are we asking them to recall something from the day before? Are we asking them to go back and dig up something about symbolism when we're talking about The Great Gatsby? Retrieval practice knows no medium. We can do it online or face-to-face. Learning is hard and takes time. How do we provide productive struggle for learners? In other words, struggle where they feel like they can get it, but they have to put forth some effort. This is a bit tough online, but we can do it. For example, we might provide them with a tough problem to do, but then we provide them with a worked example for them to use as a guide, or we provide them with the answer and tell them, keep working at it until you get the answer. We'll talk about it in our chat rooms in just a moment. Learning is hard and takes time. And then finally, feedback is a part of this. Not praise, feedback. In other words, what are they doing well? Do we tell them what they're doing well, what needs some work or opportunities for growth, and then do we give them suggestions on how to get there? In other words, is our feedback specific, constructive, and just in time? Does it tell them this is where you are, this is where we're going, and here's my suggestion on how to close the gap? Simply telling a learner, please revise, no, try again. Those are not helpful things. Something else that's not helpful, C+, B-, A+. Grades are absolutely useless when it comes to feedback. Feedback should tell the learner 3 things. Where are we going? Where are you right now? And what do we need to do to close the gap? That's what we mean by effective feedback. So as we start to wind down, I want to take just a moment and make sure we're clear on how this all unfolds. Whether we're sitting in our kitchen or our classroom, and we've talked about this, the principles of how we learn remain the same. Our trick is, where in our teaching and learning are we embedding these principles using online environments? It's important that they have elaborate encoding. It's important that they get opportunities to retrieve. It's important that we give them struggle, but it's even more important that we give them feedback. If we want learners to be able to close the gap between hot mama and heart murmur, if we want them to understand the difference between solving trig equations and simply going through the motions, we have to make an extra effort to ensure that the principles of learning are there. As you move forward in this new normal, the trick is, how do we make sure those principles are there? And keep in mind, at the end of the day, if we're going to get them to struggle, if we're going to ask them to retrieve and elaborately encode, we have to use this principle with feedback. Feedback should never be gotcha. Feedback should be, I've got you, because they are moving into a new environment just like we are as classroom teachers. The 4 principles matter. They'll close the gap between a heart murmur and a hot mama, and they are absolutely applicable regardless of the context. And with that, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And please, 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 at the end of the day, remember, we're all learners in this together. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. That was a great presentation. I liked how interactive you were with the audience. So, folks, that completes our program for this week. In 2 weeks, on May 28th, I will have another feature. We're going to feature John Hodge, Danny Brazel, and Richard Cash. You'll all receive a notification from us about that program. So please join us again on May 28th at 3 p.m. And thank you for being here.